So it's a very big topic. Let me start with a quote from an Indian politician who made a comment in 2017, and he said, "A rising tide doesn't raise people who don't have a boat. We have to build the boat for them. We have to give them the basic infrastructure to rise with the tide." So I think that kind of sums up why infrastructure is so key to development across the emerging world. But we still don't get enough investments. Why is that? So that's the question for you in the room. You should probably see a QR code. The question for you is, what is the biggest obstacle to infrastructure development in Africa? Is it bureaucratic red tape, lack of funding, inadequate policy, or corruption? In case you don't see it behind you, it'll be behind me. You'll see it on your mobile phone. So please do vote and do let us know. I'll be able to see this on my iPad here. And we'll come back to that question as soon as you've all voted. But what we want to do right now is start off with some questions for the Minister here. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. The Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area just talked about the need for infrastructure to get the most out of this block, which could be the world's biggest. But we've seen some data coming. The governments obviously have been investing, but they don't have enough funds. We really need private capital coming into infrastructure. But if you see the latest data, private sector investment in infrastructure actually dropped almost 50% in Africa in the first half of 2022. That's the latest data. But it doubled, more than doubled in India and China. So there is money that's going to the right places. So, Minister, what can governments do on the continent to lure more non-state investment? What is missing?
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator. Thank you for highlighting this very important question. And the starting point, if I can say, is it was highlighted by the predecessor panelist. I can say that investment in modern infrastructure is really key. It's very key. And taking an example of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, as it was highlighted by the panelists now, that's really expected to boost the intra-Africa trade by 52.3% by 2025, and they also to increase Africa income by $450 billion by 2035, and also, most importantly, to lift more than 30 million African people out of extreme poverty. We can say that even just to make it operational, it will be very, very key just to have adequate infrastructure that will ensure African continent that the free movement of people, capital, and goods is done as expected. So as you well highlighted, the financing gap is huge. If you try to see what's the African needs in terms of achieving the SDG-related infrastructure needs, Africa itself needs between 130 billion between 130 and 170 billion every year in terms of infrastructure needs. But when you see the financing gap, you can understand that government itself cannot do everything itself, if I can say.
But what is the government doing to lure investors?
Yes, exactly.
What is, let's say, Rwanda doing to lure investors?
Yeah, exactly. Just I come up to this point because the government itself, with already the limited fiscal space with most of the African governments, we see that there is a need just to attract more private investment. The government of Rwanda has been really working toward achieving this target by putting a conducive and an ecosystem that really attracted the private investment just to come and support the government effort through the public-private partnership, for example. We have already so far established around 60 PPPs in different sectors in energy. We have in water generation, a number of things. Because we've seen that when it comes to the political will and the political commitment just to do so, private sector and the private investment come in because they need this conducive environment. They need, first of all, I say that we need to de-risk this sector just to make sure that at the same time we reduce the risk associated with project implementation. We also ensure the private sector that the profitability is there as well. So the government of Rwanda has been working in putting, first of all, a PPP framework just to make sure that coordination is really well done. And the second, we try to go through policy reforms and establish tax incentives reforms. So to make sure that we have this environment that help the private sector just to come in. Of course, we still have a long way to go. This is why I just urge other African countries just to see all the challenges around, around the infrastructure sector needs, just to make sure that the private sector come in the appropriate way. Yeah. So, and again, in the early stage of development of project, this is where maybe part of the lesson learned. We've seen that not only we need to complete the projects just on time, something that most of the time doesn't happen as expected with the delay in the project implementation. So the early stage of development is also one of the key components that African country needs to focus on, because we've seen that when the design is not well done, when you don't have really good pipeline and bankable project with high impact, so you cannot expect the private sector to get interested in. So all those things, it's a complexity of things, but all need to be into a framework. Thank you. So
have you seen, do you want to emulate any country that has done well? Do you have any examples in your mind? Or how's your PPP looking in the sense? Is there a perfect model that you have found?
So we're trying to mimic other countries that are doing well. So our PPP framework also try to respect some standards to make sure that once we establish a PPP framework, so we follow that trend, especially for those countries that are doing well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your answer. You did mention about failures of projects to actually be completed. Now, according to McKinsey, 90% of projects don't reach financial closure. And that's a question for you, ma'am. Why is that, and what is the solution?
Okay, so I think let's step back a little bit. I think I like the way you started. You talked about India and China getting more money than Africa. I happen to have with humility, I've lived in India investing 4 years and in Korea. So I think, and I want to link it with exactly the McKinsey work, which actually we had commissioned for a fund that we have started. When you look at Asia today, right, government, which has a fiscal, invests in the core infrastructure. And what I mean core infrastructure is they lay out the groundwork, they do the cable. I happen to have lived in a city called Songdo for 4 years. And that city is only 15 years old. And government laid out everything, and they spent 40 billion. But they're going to get back their 40 billion. Because what they did then is they invited companies, like the one I worked for, to have their offices there. They gave land, that's an incentive. And then people started moving in there. Companies started moving there. POSCO has an office, Samsung has an office, everyone has offices. People start coming. Then people pay taxes, right? Because they live in the city. The government benefits. So they have a horizon of, I think, 100 years to recover that investment. But their return is significant. They get up to 40% in that 100-year time frame. Because as people move in, as services get used, the government gets taxes. They also gave tax holidays to some of those companies to first come in. But they lay down the broadband and the infrastructure. I also lived in India, which struggled for a while and then got it right. And so let's look at Africa. I think what we have is our government are fiscally strained, and they're becoming more and more strained. They went through COVID. They barely survived, and then you had the food crisis. You have many governments that are just living day to day. So that the earnest of doing this kind of long-term planning and laying out the infrastructure that you need to industrialize, to get better value for your natural resources, to build your transport, and then we have a power deficit. So you're actually going to need not only the private sector, the public, and anyone else that has money to come into Africa. So the statistics that you have from McKinsey is that we have $2.3 trillion deficit in terms of infrastructure planning from 2020 to 2028, of which most of that is in the study and in the design stage. So my institution, Africa Finance Corporation, which is an $11 billion infrastructure solutions provider, was created to really do that as an example. So we have created with the ability to do from cradle to grave. We are a public-private partnership. We're majority owned by private banks, African large banks, as well as some of the African pension funds. And then we have memberships from government, because in infrastructure, you need to de-risk the politics. So the membership of governments enables us to work with government and to de-risk these projects, get the policy framework in place. But the money that we have is mostly managed, mobilized from the African pension industry and African private banks. So how do we de-risk this? So I give you one example. In a country like Gabon, what they needed is that they were fully dependent on fossil fuel in oil, and the country is 80% forest. There was a lot of illegal logging, and there was no other industry of size. So we worked with the government, our partner, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, AFC, and an international player, Olam, and we put together an infrastructure industrial platform, which has diversified that economy from only being oil to supplier of high quality, sustainable, forest certified industrial zone. We've invited all the Chinese companies and others to produce it there. So with our partner Olam, ourselves, and the government, we also built 2 ports, all the roads that connect, and then we put together the Sustainable Industrial Park, which processes some of the natural resources of the country, both the rare metals, as well as the sustainable timber to go abroad. But that required us to really not go to the country and say, this is the checklist that you need to get this going, but it's to say, okay, this is what we need to get this infrastructure in place, and that's the roads, the ports. We have a mineral port, we have a cargo port. It's managed very well. We have invited all the companies to produce the timber. The country's GDP has changed to have almost 15% to become a furniture manufacturer. So today when you go to Dubai or in Europe or others, you have furniture that has been made in this industrial park. So I think in terms of solution, we need to have an African approach to the problem. The problem, it can't be only one person. It's everybody working together. What did Gabon did? Gabon put very good policies. They put illegal logging. They supported the industrial parks. They gave tax holidays. So I'm just making it practical so we can see what's possible when private sector, government, and the right players come together to really change the ecosystem. So you have now better pricing for the minerals. You've built the infrastructure, the ports. You have put an industrial park which employs a lot of people, and you have changed the dynamics of that country. We're doing the same thing in Benin with cotton. We're building the port. We are now, our Benin, it was just a raw material producer. Today, you have stores in America that will have jeans from Benin. And we have, kids' clothing. I think there is I forgot the name of the company because I don't have kids, but there is a kids' company that actually they just did their first supply. We're doing that with cashew nuts in parts of Ivory Coast. We're doing with agro-processing in Nigeria. So I think infrastructure in Africa cannot be looked at in isolation. It has to be looked at as supporting a major economic activity that can fund it. So that is how you're going to de-risk it, is taking the solution, getting everybody to work together to meet the end goal.
So let me bring Hamza here right now. I mean, you are a massive construction company in Morocco. What Ms. Adam said, would you kind of go ahead and build projects with that comfort that everything is in order right now?
Very good question, thank you. In reality, Morocco is a great example in looking at that. If you look at what happened over the last 20 years in this country, it was also driven by a vision by our government, our leader, and our leaders to get to the point where we understand that infrastructure is not an investment which is short-term. Investment, if you look at Tangier Port, which was built 20 years ago, originally was looked at as a massive investment for this country, without even looking at the indirect investment that will be driven by such an investment. So Tangier Port 1 was built, and then it gave birth to Tangier Med 2 and 3 today, attracted and made Morocco one of the biggest platforms for automotive industry in the region. This would not have been possible without a long discussion and a collaboration between private and public sector. If you look at Morocco over the last 3 years, it's a perfect example on what happens and magic that can happen when these entities talk together. And the real word right now in Morocco is fast track. Everything was fast tracked, from construction, which we're responsible for, to financing, to government role. And it all starts with a vision. I mean, most of the time we say the biggest problem is financing. I think the biggest problem is vision. Once the government has a vision on what he needs and what he wants to do, he finds the financing. The private sector comes on board because it's reassured that those risks are de-risked. What we've done, as a clear examples, we have built a university in 7 months in Rabat during COVID, at the peak of the pandemic, because it was needed, and the collaboration between private and public sector was so effective that also the World Bank backed the project very quickly. So I don't think that financing by itself is the problem. It's the coordination of all these entities working together. We have right now a major problem of water stress in Morocco. We've been approached by the government in the beginning of this year, around the month of January, to fast-track the highway of water, meaning connecting a region which has potential water resources needed in another region. So we're building a pipeline of 70 kilometers in 8 months. How did we do that? The discussion came, and a lot of the questions came around, is the design going to be a problem? Is the construction going to be a problem? Is the financing going to be a problem? And putting together around the table the right parties, the right entities, enabled us to do for the first time what we call the project bond. So we raised the money to bridge loan the money needed to build a project in a month through pension funds and private sector in Morocco. Government backed up this decision by the construction contract, including financing, and we're delivering the project in the month of August. So we're talking about 80-kilometer pipeline of 3-meter diameter, moving millions of meter cubes of water. This would have been impossible without such a vision, with a channel of discussions and trust. Trust is a big issue. I mean, in a lot of projects, I mean, we're active around the continent in various countries. Probably trust is the first element that generates all these financial models to put risks, risk on constructions, risk on design, risk on financing. You add up all those risks, at the end of the day, you have no project. Because that comes from the lack of trust and the lack of understanding that the project itself will generate an added value to the government, to the private sector, to the different entities. And once this is driven by the right governance, by the right vision of our leaders, all the other problems have solutions. And I think that experience showed that this is possible in all different sectors. I mean, I spoke about education, I spoke about water, I can speak also about health. Morocco has decided last year to become independent in vaccine production, and decided to launch a vaccine factory in Morocco. Again, fast track. We've been involved, and we've built the vaccine factory in 12 months with the help of private banks that acted as the investors and operators, while the government was looking for a more long-term solution. So these discussions are all possible when the drive, the leadership, and the vision is clearly stated. And that eliminates a lot of the risks that are put by all the investors that make projects collapse or just disappear when we go from a good project to a project that never is being built, just because this combination of risks put together by the different parties, not looking at the big picture, which is what are we bringing to the table long term. And this takes us also to the problem that in some of the countries, politicians and political leaders have a short-term vision. instead of being helped by higher entities to look at the long-term vision and what are we bringing to the country.
So, Minister, let me bring you here. I mean, there's a very good example that Hamza gave about the project bond and all the coordinations between everybody. Do you think governments like in Rwanda could actually do that and have successful projects in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I like that point. And when it comes to the financing instrument, innovative financing instrument, just we need to think in the long term. Because short-term projects have proven that those projects, most of the time, they don't have the high impact, and the expected economic return is really very low, taking into consideration all the effort that may have been put together just to implement those projects. This is why coming up with a financing instrument that's really target the long run and the long term is really very key. Yes, the government of Rwanda, this is something we've been doing. And when it comes to infrastructure development, we've seen that it's not only just to go through implementing all those projects in a routine way, because you've heard that recently Rwanda experienced some disasters that really caused loss and damages. And what we've learned from that, we've got this in 2018, in 2023 this year, recently. We've seen that investing in resilient infrastructure is really key, just to make sure that everything we do is done in a sustainable way. And this is why we have now been able to revise our national investment policy to make sure that the climate component is really well integrated. So which means that not only just we design those framework, but when it comes to this just closing this finance gap by attracting the private investment as well, we need to make sure that when private investors come in, they really find those instruments really helping them just to invest exactly. You've heard again that during the last COP, the COP27, Rwanda launched what we call the Ireme Invested. This is about a green investment facility that will help us just to close this gap by attracting the investors, and they help them just to get the financing from the green investment as well. So sustainability matters a lot for Rwanda because, on the part of on the planning side, we are implementing the sustainable development goals. And the SDG-related infrastructure require us to respond to these sustainability questions. So let's go ahead with those infrastructure development, but let's go ahead in a sustainable way. So having innovative financing instruments, but of course we need to analyze on the other side. When it comes to government borrowing, the debt levels need to be controlled at the same time. Coming up with concession loans, and so maybe the fiscal space might be limited, and they're rising the debt levels as well. So the private investment will always be needed, but governments need to ensure, to make sure that they have this capacity to guarantee the private sector that once they come on board, so everything has been created just to. So, and again, just to come up to what my predecessor says. So it's not only government itself, it's not the private sector itself, but it's all of us, just we need to work together. And again, something that was not mentioned in this discussion. When it comes to private investment funds, so to be able to bridge this gap, resources are available. But when it comes to the flow of resources from maybe developed country to developing countries, we don't see it happening as expected. For example, we have a sovereign wealth fund, we have pension funds, around 2 trillion in Africa. And out of Africa, we also know that there is more and more. So why cannot we maybe put all our efforts together, Africa and the other countries, just to make sure that infrastructure development is really done in the expected way? Thank you.
And one more question, actually, on financing, and since we are spending a lot of time on that. Development finance institutions work at a glacial pace, right? And they take ages to kind of, provide funding and everything. So what do they need to do to change, ma'am, for you, actually, Ms. Adams? What do they need to change to kind of be faster? Because Africa is the youngest continent, and they really need progress now.
Yeah. So I think, we are a private sector DFI. So We have to be faster, and we have to deliver projects on time. We are an investment-grade institution. We are the second or the third highest. So for us, we can't waste time. But actually, it's the ownership of the problem. You need to live in this continent to realize, and most of our money is African money. So we don't have those kind of hangs up about the perception of risk. So even Moody's published a report just before COVID, which showed the default rates of all the region. Middle East was number 1. Africa was number 2 in terms of lowest default rates. So there's this perception of risk that's overblown and over-exaggerated. We do have risks in terms of currency, in terms of other factors, which are inherent in our projects, but it's not a default rate, because most of our governments are paying through their nose to guarantees most of these PPA. There may be delays, there may be some restructuring because of a macro event, but in general, most of our projects have the second lowest default rates in the world. So there is that. So I think for us, it's Africa taking ownership of its this is our last mile financing. So I have been working in this space for a very long time. I've worked for many different DFIs. And there was a time where Africa didn't have a very well-developed banking sector. We cannot say that anymore. Africa has a pretty solid banking industry. We've had general private equity come in. I think the last mile financing is our really infrastructure which will enable industrialization and value capture for our resources. And that's why, for me, this is the sector that is going to need us to think outside of the box and to go with the attitude, I want to make this project happen. Unfortunately, a lot of DFIs are not that connected. So they're not development, but they are also look like private sector, and their systems are very burdensome with significant amount of red tape that makes it very difficult for them to really be nimble in coming up with the approach. And hence, an institution like ours, we've put now $10 billion in a matter of just 12 years. It's because there is absence. Our pipeline is much bigger. We still haven't received much foreign investment. But the reality is, if you have the willingness and are able to come to the table quickly, the governments do listen. They do change regulation. They don't want to change things and then I'll come 5 years from now. So a huge part of our success is the fact that we get things done, right? And we get things done on time. And the governments that we've worked with have played along to support us in putting together the right legal and regulatory framework to make that particular PPA work.
We're running out of time, so 20 seconds each. What is the most important thing for Africa to create jobs and be inclusive? I mean, is it energy, electricity, water? What is the most important infrastructure? Hamza, let me start with you.
Well, I think it's a combination. There's not one that can solve the issue. It's a combination of having the right resources at the right time. And I think time to market is a big issue. I mean, we have all this vision of what we need. We need to be able to deliver it as fast as possible and make sure that we lay the foundations of the next generations, finding and arriving on an Africa that has all what it needs to be up to the standards, up to the level of living, up to the level of business doing in the world as an integrated continent.
Infrastructure, I would say, and infrastructure broadly. I think we need to invest in our education infrastructure, our health infrastructure, our roads, our transport infrastructure, our power infrastructure. We also need to really integrate climate elements into the entire ecosystem, not just the agriculture, but resilient infrastructure. So you need infrastructure and it's all interconnected. Skills development, skills training, and we need to also invest in partnership infrastructure to get the continent to where it should be.
Minister.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think investment in infrastructure is really key, and nothing else can accelerate intra-Africa trade and the economic growth without more than infrastructure. So I think as it was highlighted, it's a combination of things. We need the financing, we need the resources, we need commitment, government commitment, we need the private sector commitment. We need to make sure that infrastructure is done in priority number in different sectors, starting by, education, in the health sector. We need to make sure that both the rural and the urban area, are balanced when it comes to the basic need in terms of infrastructure, even just to make sure that it's also, it impact on other sectors of the economy, agriculture, for example, and so. So I think it's a combination, it's a complexity, but let's all of us get committed, and let's our government also take the lead just to ensure, the ownership and something else. This political stability is also key when it comes to regional infrastructure. It doesn't mean that if one country is really willing to do, the other country, if is not creating the working environment, it will not be leading to the expected target. So it's all of us, it's a combination of things and a strong commitment to any stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's been fantastic. It's a massive topic. We could go on, but thank you, everybody. Thanks.